Dallas, Texas. In 1963, it became known as one thing, the city where JFK was killed. It was a dark moment in history. However, by 1980, Dallas had completely changed its image, one of which was with sports. In 1960, the Dallas Cowboys of the NFL were established. In the 1970s, they appeared in 5 Super Bowls and won 2 of them. Led by legendary players and coaches, they became known as this.
Cowboy goals are lofty. Win the National Football Conference title and then the Super Bowl. This is usually attainable, for as their fans well know, the sum total of their stars make up a galaxy. Their record is envied, and their innovations copied down to the last glamorous detail. They appear on television so often that their faces are as familiar to the public as presidents and movie stars. They are the Dallas Cowboys, America's team.
For college football, you had Southern Methodist University, better known as SMU, who just recently landed 2 of the top recruits. They would become one of the best teams in the country in the early 1980s. This was despite being on probation in 1981 for recruiting violations. More on this later. In the 1970s, Dallas also experienced a boom in the real estate and oil industry. In 1978, the primetime soap opera Dallas premiered, telling the story of the Ewing family. Dallas had completely rebuilt its image. It was now a city of rich and glory, rather than one of tragedy. It's 1980, and President Jimmy Carter is up for re-election. However, his presidency had been challenging. He was scrutinized for the energy crisis and the hostage situation in Iran. A failed rescue attempt in April had many Americans doubting his leadership. In the Democratic primary, he was challenged by Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy, also the brother of JFK and RFK. However, Kennedy was hurt by the Chappaquiddick incident of 1969, where he agreed to drive passenger Mary Jo Kopnick from a party to her hotel. It's unknown if Kennedy was under the influence. However, he crashed the car off a narrow bridge into a pond by Chappaquiddick. Kennedy would end up escaping, but he left Kopnick behind, who was trapped and she ended up drowning. Kennedy did not report the accident. Despite this, Kennedy would only receive a slap on the wrist, serving only a 2-month suspended prison sentence. He served as senator of Massachusetts until his death in 2009. Talk about facing no consequences for your action. Likely because of this, Kennedy lost the nomination to Carter. For the Republicans, they had some interesting candidates. One of them was John Connally, a former Democrat and governor of Texas. However, Connally was hurt by a 1974 indictment for pocketing $10,000 from a journalist. He would end up being acquitted. One person who testified for him was a woman named Barbara Jordan, the first black female state senator in Texas history. He would end up dropping out. One person for the Republican nominee was a man who Connally helped start up, George H.W. Bush. He had come a long way since his 2 Senate defeats. He had served as ambassador to the UN in China and director of the CIA. He was well established in the Republican Party. He seemed like a strong candidate to get the party nomination. However, one person stood in his way. Ronald Reagan. Reagan was a popular movie actor in the 1940s and 50s.
Keep pursuing,
always loving,
hotter than a baker's oven.
this is true.
Reagan originally was a staunch Democrat. However, in the 60s, his views shifted more conservative. The person who influenced them was none other than Barry Goldwater, who Reagan passionately supported in 1964. Reagan would join the Republican Party and serve as governor of California from 1967 to 1973. He was an even stronger candidate to get the nomination. Bush would challenge Reagan in the primary. He touted his foreign policy experience in Reagan's economic policy, which he referred to as this.
Anyone? Anyone seen this before? The Laffer curve. Anyone know what this says? It says that at this point on the revenue curve, you will get exactly the same amount of revenue as at this point. This is very controversial. Does anyone know what Vice President Bush called this in 1980? Anyone? Something DOO economics. Voodoo economics.
However, he was no match for Reagan, and Reagan would end up getting the Republican Party nomination. However, Reagan would now need to pick a vice president nominee. He considered former President Gerald Ford even at one point. Despite the hostility originally between them, he chose to go with Bush to be his vice president, mainly because Bush was well established in DC politics and his foreign policy was useful during the Cold War. One person who entered the race was Illinois Representative John B. Anderson. He was basically the happy medium of Reagan and Carter, attacking Reagan for being too conservative and Carter for being too liberal. For the 1980 presidential election, Ronald Reagan would end up dominating, easily defeating Carter. With the exception of Georgia, which was Carter's home state, he ended up taking all of the Deep South. He even took Texas by 13% over Carter. Shortly before Reagan was inaugurated, the hostages from Iran would be released.
Impossible, I tell you! Impossible! My trap was perfect! How did he do it? I have to know! Somebody tell me! It's not fair! There was no way, I tell you! No way he could have gotten out! Somebody tell me! Do you hear me? Somebody tell me how he did it! I have to know! I have to know!
So, how were they doing it? It seemed impossible for the Republicans to take the Deep South, but they were doing it. So, how? Meet Lee Atwater. He worked under South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond in the 1970s and served as a political strategist to several other Republicans. When Reagan became president in 1981, he joined the administration as an aide. In 1981, he gave an interview talking about how Republicans were appealing towards Southern voters. I will warn you, there is some offensive language that I have censored.
Start out in 1954 by saying by 1968 you can't say because that hurts you, it backfires, so you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously maybe that is part of it, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract. You know. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner.
What Atwater is talking about is how you appeal to white Southern voters on the issue of race, but without coming off as a racist. Note, I am not saying white Southern voters are all racist and against civil rights. I am also not saying that the Reagan campaign was racist. Reagan said in a Mississippi rally that he supported states' rights. It was near the site of where 3 civil rights leaders were murdered. However, Reagan also did say he supported civil rights when at a rally in New York and attacked Southern politicians, comparing some of them to members of the Ku Klux Klan. It's important to note, politics differ from area to area. The way the Republicans made appeals towards the South is controversial and debated by historians. In 2006, the RNC apologized to the NAACP. The real truth is simple, in my opinion. Politicians want to be elected, and they will do whatever it takes to achieve such power. Okay, now, back to Texas politics. It's 1982 and it's gubernatorial election time. Bill Clemens was running for re-election and was nominated by the Republican Party. For the Democrats, it was Attorney General Mark White. Clemens' tenure was hurt when his offshore drilling company was involved in an oil spill that caused major environmental destruction. The one leading the lawsuit was none other than his opponent, Mark White. Because of that, White would end up defeating Clemens to be elected governor. It would be a good night for Texas Democrats. Senator Lloyd Bentsen was elected to a third term, destroying his Republican challenger. However, Bill Clemens had this to say to Mark White about his defeat.
I'll be back.
White wanted to focus on improving education in Texas. To improve education, in 1984, he signed Texas House Bill No. 72. It became known by its critics as no pass, no play. The law required that students could not participate in extracurricular activities unless they maintained a 70 or above grade. The law did have some supporters, one of which was a Dallas businessman named Ross Perot. However, it had more haters than fans. One thing big in Texas is high school football. Some kids could not participate due to failing class grades. One small-town Texas mayor believed it cost his town a shot at a championship. White's approval rating dropped hard, and many seemed ready to vote him out. Before we have a presidential election. Apart from a failed assassination attempt, Ronald Reagan's first 4 years were strong, featuring a good economy and low unemployment. It was going to be a challenge to defeat Reagan. For the Democrats, the nominee ended up being former Vice President Walter Mondale. Even Mondale knew defeating Reagan would be a challenge. He did something unprecedented at the time. He chose a New York congressman named Geraldine Ferraro to be his vice president. She was the first female to be nominated for a vice president in major party's history. The pick was divisive by some. Some saw it as a progressive pick. However, some saw it as a gimmick by Mondale to get media attention. Also in 1984, Texas had a Senate election. John Tower chose not to run for re-election and decided to retire. The Republican nomination would end up going to Congressman Phil Gramm. Gramm was a former Democrat. He even challenged Lloyd Bentsen in 1976. Reagan was a member of the conservative Democrats. He was supportive of many of Reagan's politics. Well, because of this, he would end up being kicked off the House Budget Committee. In protest, he resigned from his seat. A special election would be held to fill that seat. Reagan would end up running, but this time as a Republican and would be elected back to his old seat. The pettiness is real right here. The Democrats had many interesting candidates trying to win the Senate seat. They included three: Lloyd Doggett, a state representative from Austin, Kent Hance, a congressman from Lubbock, and our old friend Bob Kruger, a congressman from New Braunfels. However, each three of them were different. Hance was a conservative who supported Reagan's economic policies and attacked the others for their support of gay rights. Doggett was a liberal and attacked Reagan's economic policies. Kruger, meanwhile, was kind of the happy medium. Yeah, lots of happy mediums. The race between the three each received 31% of the vote. However, since no one crossed the 50% threshold, so a runoff election would be held. Doggett and Hance finished above Kruger, so they advanced. Doggett would win the runoff to get the Democratic nomination. However, he was defeated easily by Phil Gramm, who would be elected as Texas's new senator. I'm going to assume Texas did not want two senators named Lloyd. Don't feel too bad for Doggett. In 1995, he was elected to the House of Representatives, and as of 24, he's still serving, even at age 77. The 1984 presidential election between Reagan and Mondale. Reagan faced many questions about his age. He was 73 years old and was now the oldest president to serve.
I recall yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Mondale would never get much momentum. He lagged behind in the polls. Oh my god. Oh my god.
Oh my God!
Reagan just destroyed Mondale. He received 525 electoral votes, a record still. That was every state but Minnesota. Minnesota was Mondale's home state, but even that race was close. Texas was also vote Republican in back-to-back years for the first time since Dwight Eisenhower. Reagan won Texas by 27%. It's time for another Goober national election, everyone. Mark White was running for re-election. However, his popularity was still hurt by the no pass, no play law. White and many other Texas Democrats defending it, believing it was important to the state's future, but no one really seemed to care. The election would also be held in November, during football season. The person challenging him was the person he had defeated 4 years prior, Bill Clemens. After his defeat in 1982, Clemens was elected to the board of directors of Southern Methodist University. SMU was known for their football team in the early 1980s. It featured Hall of Famer Eric Dickerson and former top recruit Craig James. Their offense was known as the Pony Express. However, SMU had run a slush fund and paid players under the table, breaking NCAA rules. In 1981, they were put on probation for recruiting violations. This hurt their shot at a national championship that year. They would be punished again in 1985. At a meeting in New Orleans, the NCAA passed a new law called the Repeat Violator Clause. However, it became known in the media and the public as the death penalty, meaning if the school was found guilty of 2 major rule violations within 5 years, it would not be allowed to field a team for at least 2 years. With this going on, Clemens and SMU directors promised to stop the payments. Clemens would heavily attack White for his politics. Clemens would be endorsed by Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Graham, and John Tower. Clemens would end up defeating White to become governor of Texas again. However, it got off to a rocky start. Despite claiming the payments had stopped, Clement and Bouters instead chose to phase out the payments. They continued to pay players they had already made commitments, even after they were busted in 1985. Once again, they would be found guilty of violations by the NCAA and would be given the death penalty. SMU would not field a football team in 1987. Clemens would apologize for his role and was even facing calls for impeachment. It never came to be, and Clemens announced he would not run for re-election in the 1990. I'm glossing over a ton from the SMU football scandal, and I strongly recommend the ESPN documentary Pony Excess if you are interested in learning more. I strongly recommend it. Russian leader Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan had a positive relationship. It would mark the end of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
This marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union would be dissolved in 1991 and the Berlin Wall came down. The economy was strong and America was moving into the 1990s stronger than ever. It was not all sunshines and daisies under Reagan. Members of the Reagan administration from 1981 to 1986 illegally sold weapons to Iran and used proceeds to fund the Contras. not the video game, but a rebel group in Nicaragua. Reagan would appoint now former Senator John Tower to investigate it. Several members would be indicted by Congress. However, to some, it was just a blip on the radar for most people. Reagan would not be allowed to run for re-election in 1988 due to term limits, but the person who looked like the best man to replace him was none other than George H.W. Bush. As Vice President, Bush took a traditional BP role, staying in the background and standing by Reagan. Bush and Reagan had a solid working relationship. Bush even convinced Reagan to bring in his longtime partner James Baker on board. Baker served as Reagan's chief of staff from 1981 to 1985. He then served as Secretary of the Treasury from 1985 to 1988. He would end up stepping down from his position to serve as Bush's campaign chairman for his 1988 presidential campaign. The reason I'm introducing him is because he's an important character in both Texas and American politics. Bush would also appoint Lee Atwater to serve as campaign manager. The Bush campaign did not start out easy. He was challenged by Kansas Senator Bob Dole and televangelist Pat Robertson. In the Iowa caucus, Bush finished third. However, Bush edged Dole out for the New Hampshire primary, and after a strong Super Tuesday, Bush got the Republican nomination for president. Next for Bush was to pick a vice president. There were some interesting people to choose from. It included Bob Dole, his wife Elizabeth, who had served under Reagan as transportation secretary, Jack Kemp, a congressman from New York and former football player, and Dan Quayle, a young senator from Indiana. One person who approached Lee Atwater with the idea of vice president was New York real estate developer Donald Trump. Bush shocked many and chose Dan Quayle. The selection was mixed. Quayle was relatively unknown, and his youth was either a strength or weakness depending on who you asked. The 1988 RNC, Bush made this bold promise.
And I'm the one who will not raise taxes. My opponent now says he'll raise them as a last resort or a third resort. But when a politician talks like that, you know that's one resort he'll be checking into. And my opponent won't rule out raising taxes, but I will, and the Congress will push me to raise taxes, and I'll say no. And they'll push, and I'll say no. And they'll push again, and I'll say to them, read my lips. No new taxes.
For the Democrats, they were looking to move on from 1984. Gary Hart emerged as a strong candidate, but he ended up withdrawing after it was revealed he had an extramarital affair. And he tried to get New York Governor Mario Cuomo to run, but he declined. One person who did make a run at the nomination was Delaware Senator Joe Biden. However, he failed to stand out and faced controversy over plagiarizing a speech. The nominee ended up going to Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, who was the one who outed Biden for plagiarizing the speech. Dukakis was heavily praised for a Massachusetts economic turnaround. For vice president, he chose to go with Texas Senator Lloyd Vincent. In some way, it was similar to another campaign, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. Dukakis was from Boston, like Kennedy. Benson was from Austin, just like Lyndon Johnson. Dukakis also likely picked Benson as a way to steal Texas from Bush. The Bush campaign would brutally attack Dukakis. Bush used the term Massachusetts liberal to describe caucus. It almost seemed like Bush had created a new curse word. They accused soft on crime with this notorious ad.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
This ad is controversial for featuring a black inmate. Campaign manager Lee Atwater even spread rumors about Dukakis, claiming his wife had burned an American flag and Dukakis had mental illness problems. None of this turned out to be true, obviously. Dukakis did not respond to these attacks in the best way. The Bush campaign is making false accusations about me? The Dukakis campaign would also turn to dirty tactics, such as accusing Bush of having an affair. However, like the others, this was also false. In response to the claim of being soft on crime in the military, he did a photo op of him riding on a tank.
You serious?
It backfired badly. There was one highlight from the Dukakis campaign, and it came from Lloyd Bentsen. Like I said earlier, the selection of Dan Quayle as vice president was mixed. His youth and inexperience was one of them. However, he had a reputation of stumbling over his words and creating many gaffes. In response to the criticism of his youth, Quayle argued that he had the same amount of years of experience as John F. Kennedy. Bentsen had this to say about this at the vice presidential debate.
Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
That was really uncalled for, Senator.
You're the one that was making the comparisons, Senator.
It's important to note it's unlikely that Bentsen and Kennedy were actually friends and that this was just something that Bentsen had prepared. It was really the only highlight of what many believe is a forgettable presidential campaign. George H.W. Bush would end up easily defeating Dukakis to be elected president. He received over 400 electoral votes and is the last president to ever do so. Remember when I said Bush would get back at Bentsen? Well, he kinda did. It would be more of a revenge if Bentsen was the one actually running for president, but hey, revenge nonetheless. As I said, Dukakis picked Bentsen as a way to carry Texas. However, Bush would end up carrying Texas by over 11%. Texas was about to become a lost cause for the Democrats soon.
Raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
George H.W. Bush would be sworn in as the 41st President of the United States in January of 1989. The first step for Bush was to set up a presidential cabinet. James Baker was appointed Secretary of State. For defense, Bush chose to go with John Tower. Despite retiring in 1985, Tower was still involved with D.C. politics, serving as an advisor to Reagan and even investigating the Iran-Contra affair. He even worked as a negotiator during the Strategic Arm Reduction Talks, or SALT. To the shock of everyone, however, talk was rejected for the nomination. The last time the Senate rejected a cabinet nominee was in 1950 when it rejected Louis Strauss for the position of Secretary of Commerce. I wonder if someone would make a movie about that. So why was John Tower rejected? Remember when he was accused back in 1978 of being a heavy drinker and how it would come back to hurt him? He also faced allegations of womanizing. It's important to note that in 1983, the FBI did a background check on Tower. It concluded that he was not an alcoholic, but did abuse it. Tower admitted to not always being a good boy, but claimed the allegations were over-exaggerated. Bush heavily criticized the decision. Instead, he chose to go with Wyoming Representative Dick Cheney. Cheney would end up getting confirmed. As of 2024, Tower is the last cabinet appointment rejected by Congress. Maybe this should be Christopher Nolan's next movie. Bush still wished to have Tower as part of his administration, and he was instead appointed as an advisor. He would only serve 1 year, though. On April 5, 1991, John Tower and his daughter both died aboard Atlantic Southeast Airlines Flight 2311 when it crashed on landing. He remains one of the most influential senators in Texas history. So who is currently winning the Battle of Texas? Easy, the Republicans. They swept all 3 presidential races and held on to the Senate seat. However, it was not all doom and gloom for the Democrats. For one thing, Lloyd Bentsen had won re-election for a 4th term. The Republicans were winning the battle, but they had not yet won the war. The Dukakis-Bentsen ticket was a disappointing attempt to win back the White House. However, there was one highlight, the 1988 DNC, and I think you know what it is. It was Rob Lowe's sex tape scandal. However, the second highlight, was Ann Richards, the Texas State Treasurer, delivered a big moment.
The greatest nation of the free world has had a leader for 8 straight years that has pretended that he cannot hear our questions over the noise of the helicopters. And we know he doesn't want to answer, but we have a lot of questions. And when we get our questions asked, or there is a leak, or an investigation, the only answer we get is, I don't know, or I forgot. But you wouldn't accept that answer from your children. And for 8 straight years, George Bush hasn't displayed the slightest interest in anything we care about. And now that he's after a job that he can't get appointed to, he's like Columbus discovering America. He's found childcare. He's found education. Poor George. He can't help it. He was born with a silver foot in his mouth.
With the 1990 Texas gubernatorial election coming up, she seemed like she could be a strong candidate.
Loving you isn't the right